Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lynn Holland, and I'm the administrator of SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk, Introduction to our series on data management research. SPARC's research team consists of a mix of graduate and PhD students from across various disciplines. For the last 6 months, they have been intensively exploring how data is understood across social sciences disciplines and the issues and opportunities for research data management across fields. So I'd like to turn it over to Moyo and to Mohamed.
So good morning, and thank you for joining the SPARC Talk today. My name is Moyo, and my colleague Mohamed and I will be giving a presentation on research data management in social sciences. So just a quick introduction to who we are as a group. SPARC is a Center for Social Research Innovation, and we have a co-lab space in McMaster University on the 5th floor of the Wilson building. We offer research support services such as methods consultation, methods training, which involves both introductory, basic, and advanced training on qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. We also offer software training for many applications, which includes SCADA, R, and Excel. And lastly, we offer direct research support such as data collection, data analysis, and academic writing. We also house the Secure Empirical Analysis Lab, which is a high security lab with a number of data sets from companies, governments, researchers, as well as community partners. And we send out bi-weekly newsletters to members of the social sciences faculty to keep up to date on talks such as this and also research-related materials. I would like to give a special shout out to Isaac and his team at McMaster's Research Data Management Services for providing us with resources for this presentation. So why do we care about research data management? Before I dive into that, I would like to introduce some definitions that are important in the research data management literature. And the first definition is the reproducibility, which is the ability to duplicate the results of earlier studies using the same materials and procedures that were used by the original investigators. So for example, I could go to a journal, I could download the paper and its associated data and repeat the procedure on the original data. On the other hand, replicability is the ability of a researcher to duplicate the results of a prior study if the same procedures are followed, but new data are collected. In this case, this would be like if I had that same journal article that I downloaded, but instead of using the data that they use for the analysis, I come up with my own data. So for example, if they use the labor force survey for the analysis, I could use the census and hoping to get similar results. Over the years, researchers have shown that the results of many studies are almost impossible to replicate or reproduce. And when they are, it's extremely hard. This is a big problem because if studies cannot be replicated, then they cannot be verified. And this is especially important for sciences. In the early 2010s, there were a series of reviews that were done showing low replication rates in academia, and this caused major shakeups in medicine and social psychology. For example, in psychology, out of 97 studies with significant results, only 36% were successfully replicated. And in medicine, we had similar low replication rates, but it was about 44%. And what this tells us is that in these fields, about 55 to 60% of published papers could not be replicated, and that is a big problem. So what are some of the contributing factors to the low rate of reproducibility? The first is publication bias, which is a situation where studies reporting significant or positive results are more likely to be published. And so researchers might emphasize results that do not represent the overall research evidence. Another contributing factor is the publish or perish culture, which is the pressure to publish, and this encourages neglect of good scientific practices. So for example, because papers who are replicated have a lower probability of being published, it doesn't encourage people to conduct these replication exercises. Other questionable data analysis practices such as hacking, which is hypothesizing after the results are known, selective reporting, and poor RDM practices could also contribute to this replication crisis. So what is research data management? Research data management involves handling data effectively and appropriately throughout the life cycle of a research project and beyond. It involves all the aspects of the data, for example, the creating, storing, the sharing, and also the archiving of the data. In this picture that I have here, it shows the life cycle of research data. And research data management ensures that we consider the data management approach from the beginning to the end. So the first thing we have to do is we have to plan, right? Before collecting data, we have to think carefully about how the data will be created. We have to think about what types of data we would generate, how much data do we intend on collecting, and what format do we want this data in. These are important questions that we have to consider when we're thinking about our grant applications, when we're thinking about ethics applications, or even just a research proposal. It's also important that at this stage, we also consider the data sharing agreements to kind of see if there are any restrictions to the data. The next stage is the collection stage. Here we have started the research project. We're collecting data, and it's particularly important in this stage that we document the data collected, ensuring that we think about file structure, we think about naming to ensure that anyone who picks the data can understand what is being written. So for example, instead of having your data file saved as sample 1, you could make it a lot more descriptive to include more information on the type of data that you're collecting. So for example, sample 1 collected on this date for this groups of individuals, and just making sure that we have proper file management and organize the folders. The next stage is the analysis stage. And this involves ensuring that we document every step that we're taking, every step of the way, because it's extremely important for anyone who wants to replicate the study to understand what you're going through or what was going through your mind when you did the analysis. So you want to explain the rationale behind the decisions you're making, why you're making them, so that it's easy to replicate the study. The next stage is the publication and sharing stage. And here you think of where you want to publish the data or how you intend on sharing the research paper at the end. It's also very important for you to ask if you're allowed to share whatever data that you've collected from your research and consider factors that might restrict you from being able to share. Last but certainly not the least is the discovery and reuse phase. This is a phase that ensures that the data remains accessible, data is usable in the long term, and it encourages reproducibility. Anyone that has access to your data would be able to pick up whatever information that you've written down and replicate the study. One important piece of research data management is looking at where and how you store your data. You want to think of, how would you ensure that sensitive data are protected? You'd also want to think about, data storage and backup so you don't get into situations whereby you lose your data. So those are important components of research data management. So why is research data management important? First, it helps us to recognize the value of the data sets. It ensures that data is accessible and shareable. And just in general, it takes time to get good data sets with proper documentation. And so having good research data management practices helps us to value the data sets that we already have. Second, it helps us to keep research safe and secure, preventing the loss of data and information. This would definitely save a lot of time as well as stress. If you have your data properly managed, if you have backups, you're less likely to run into data loss. It also enhances reproducibility and replicability, improving research integrity. This is like the whole thing that was going on in medicine and social psychology, is that if you have good data management practices, it would be very easy to, check the integrity of some of the papers that are out there. And lastly, it supports public access to research, making research output more visible and preventing duplication of efforts. Again, if you have a proper data management, you are less likely to run into duplication of efforts because the work is already out there. Everyone can see what you've done, and people can learn from the steps that you took in your own research. So here I have a few data management practices you can implement. The first is to create a data management plan for your research projects. I'll talk a little bit more about what the data management plan is supposed to look like. You can also find and reuse existing data. Again, just to prevent duplication of efforts, just go out there, you find data that is already existing, use it for your analysis. And this would also encourage replication of and verification of studies. You can also store your data safely and securely. We'll talk a little bit more about data, storing your data safely in the coming slides. You can document your data, remembering that every aspect of the research is data in itself, like your output is data, your syntax is data, your decision making is data. So documenting every step of the way is very important. And lastly, you can share your data openly if you can. If you have a project that you've done, if it's not confidential, it's something that you can share, you can put that out there so that people can also learn from your data. So a key part of research data management is having a data management plan. And a data management plan is just a blueprint for what will be done throughout the life cycle of the project. And it can also help to predict what you will need to do during and beyond the project. So some of the things that would be important for you to have in your data management plan would be, to know who is responsible for each part or each aspect of the project, to know what type of data is being collected, for you to know how the data is to be organized and documented during collection and also during the analysis phase. It's also important for you to have, where your data is going to be stored, like what backup options do you have? Also, who can access the data? Is it data that just a few people can access, or is it something that at the end you're going to be able to publish the data? And also think about how the data will be preserved in the long term when you think about the format of the data. Here are some of the reasons why you need a data management plan. First is to avoid potential pitfalls and problems before they occur. So for example, you can think of loss of data or duplication of efforts if you have a co-author. And this goes back to, if you have at the beginning of the project, a plan that tells you who you're supposed to do what, you are less likely to duplicate efforts. As well as if you have a plan on where to store data and how you intend on storing it, you're less likely to experience data loss. Creating a data management plan also prepares you for future stages of the research, including potential data sharing, which is important for some of the journals that you'll be submitting your papers to. Having a plan on how you intend on sharing your data is very important. And last but certainly not the least is that it's becoming a requirement for many funding agencies as they require a data management plan as part of a grant application. So this is a very good reason why you should create a data management plan, because if you think of applying for grants, especially with the tri-agency, starting in beginning of this year, they started requiring a data management plan. So it's important that you have that as well. So before I pass it on to Mohamed, I would like to show some resources here from McMaster Research Data Management Services. They have lots of recorded webinars available online. But if you have further questions, you can always reach out to them and they'll be happy to answer your questions on research data management. So I'm just going to stop here and pass it on to Mohamed.
Thanks, Moyo. Hi, everyone. So I will be continuing the presentation from this point on, and I would start by talking about how to store your data safely. So Moyo have discussed the issues with research data management and the limitations we have. And one of the main things that would enable research data management is for these data to be stored properly and to be properly accessible. So starting with storing your data safely, you have two steps. One of them is to avoid the data loss, and then the second step is for the IT security. To avoid data loss, like theft or loss of devices, accidental damage, or destruction, um, these are basically or measures that we should be taking to prevent data loss. For IT security, like computer viruses, malwares, and ransomwares, these are some few of the issues that can happen to the devices that these data are stored on. To avoid data loss, you need to make sure that you have more than one copy of your data. So you can follow these steps or rules in order to strategically back up your data. First of all, or the third step is copying of your data on a different platform or device. So having different copies of your data on different devices or platforms, like different cloud services, or one on a cloud service and one on a hard drive, for example, this would definitely make it feasible for you to make sure that you have your data, you can access it, and it's not lost when it's not on one of the platforms. The second is the copies. They should be on hand. So a production copy, and this is basically where the data you're working on, and a backup copy, which is a static copy. Basically, are not changing it unless you are doing a new backup. So when like periodically you are doing backups, so you have a production copy where you are working on, modifying, and so on, and then a backup copy where you upload your data. The final thing is copying in another location, offsite, basically, with a trusted service provider, like a cloud service or a server where you can keep your data safe. The second thing, which is the IT security, you can enable something called multi-factor authentication. For those who are not familiar with, MFA is basically, for example, if you try to log into Outlook, for example, you get this message of sending, like after dialing in the password, they ask you if they send you a message, for example, to your email or another email or your number to authenticate basically your login. Similar to that, there are so many ways for multi-factor authentication depending on the platform you're using and the software you're using or the hardware you're using. You can utilize different ways to authenticate the access to the data. The second thing is to follow good password practices everywhere. So in your online uses specifically, and on those devices that are accessible using the internet. So to have good passwords and to regularly change the passwords is a very good practice. So use unique passwords for each important service or device or website. Use a good password for your computer itself and your phone. Consider using a password manager. Don't share your password with anyone. These are basically common practices to avoid theft of data. And just to let you know that October is Cybersecurity Month. So if you are not already following these practices, take a moment and do all of these to your accounts and devices. The most important question now is, where should you store the data? So there are many ways you can store the data. You have, if you're looking for a good place, you can store the data. You can use the Research Data Storage Finder web tool, where you can get personalized recommendations here at u.mcmaster.ca storage finder. You can also check the RDM recorded webinar on the data storage in this link here, cds.github.io, and through RDM storage.html, you can find this RDM webinar. The second aspect is to document the data in order for you to be able to store it, right? So data documentation helps you keeping good records on and metadata. Everything you need to replicate your study or experiment. You can use note-taking softwares such as OneNote to organize documentation, or QDA software for qualitative research. Code books and data dictionaries for surveys and tabular data. can be used as well. You can also utilize consistent file naming and folder organization so that accessibility to your data wouldn't be an issue, no matter if you are basically handing off a project or you are on a project that's a long-term project. Making sure that you have consistent naming for each project is very crucial and important. So for example, if you start your file name with dates like that, 2022, 10, or 3, then the file name, they will sort by date automatically, and then you wouldn't be having any issues. And if the file name is important, you can start with the file name and so on. So you find the most characteristic information of the file and you make it the file name. Data sharing and reuse. So open and free data sharing supports research ideals, like transparency, accessibility, reproducibility, and collaboration. And it also maximizes the impact and visibility of research. So if you have a more shareable research, that means it would be more accessible, and definitely it would give more impact to your work. Some of the key questions to consider here is, what do you plan to do with your data once then published? So when you publish your data, is it the end of the journey? Is it that's what your goal should be, or should you be seeking other steps afterwards? So basically, in order for research to be accessible and be impactful, if your data is accessible, that would give your research higher impact. Also, how you will ensure that your data remains accessible to you and others in the long term. And these are basically the questions that can be answered with the RDM practices. The data sharing and reuse supports reproducibility and increases trust in research. So the more your data is, the more your findings are reproducible, the more impactful and the more trustworthy will be your research. The data sharing and reuse also supports open access to scholarship by non-academics and academics in LMIC and the Global South. So basically, open access is one of the main crucial aspects here. Just to give you an insight on the requirements and increasing requirements for data sharing in social sciences, as you can see here, authors are encouraged to share or make open the data supporting the results or analysis, deposit the data sets in a recognized data repository, to cite any data sets referenced in the article and provide a data availability statement. This is shared from the Information Communication Society data sharing policy. And also in the International Sociology data policy, you can read that requests all author to submit any primary data used in the research articles or provide detailed information in their articles on how the data can be obtained. So the more information you share about your data, not the data itself, but about your data, is crucial to make your data accessible. Also in the Canadian Journal of Economics data availability policy, you can see that it's CGE policy to publish papers only if the data and code used in the analysis are clearly and precisely documented and are readily available to any researcher for purposes of replication. Authors of accepted papers that contain any original empirical work, simulations, or experimental work must provide to the CGE prior to publication the data, programs, data citations, and other details of the computations sufficient to permit replication. So as you can see, more organizations and more journals are enforcing the value of data sharing policies. So actually, some of the journals, as you can see, will not allow any publication to take place unless you provide the source code of what you're doing or the simulation data that you got from your work. So this brings you to the point where to share your data. So when you're ready to share your data, you should consider where you will deposit it securely, for sure. So choosing a trusted data repository such as the McMaster Dataverse or the Qualitative Data Repository, the QDR, the ICPSR or the Nature Scientific Data, the Data Repository Guidance. All of these locations can be used to store your data and share it. For the archival and preservation purposes, if you would like to preserve your data, the data sets are given to DOIs, then the data sets are in platforms that have plans for long-term storage, and the data sets are published with enough documentation to enable the reuse or the reanalysis, which is basically the main goal of the RDM. I think after discussing the, the methods to do RDM and the need for RDM, let's discuss what is the current state and what's missing. So across social science fields, in each field, we will just be taking a moment to discuss what's missing and what's the current state. So for example, in anthropology, anonymization is one of the main aspects. So processes of anonymization could potentially remove the context, making data meaningless. So sometimes doing anonymization is basically making the data unusable. So that either leads to inability to share data or inability to reproduce data. The lack of standards for collecting digital data then is one of the issues. So from the side of journals and the side of organizations, there are no much information for data collection, or specifically digital data collection. The consent is ongoing. Research materials also continue to evolve and change after collection rather than being a fixed product like in many other disciplines. And archives and data repositories limit editing and commenting on evolving data. In field like economics, it's a slightly different issue, as replication, reproducibility, and data availability are the main concerns. And as you can see, there is a pattern basically appearing here. As codes and data are not available for replication and verification of studies, and the onus is on journals to enforce policies again, just like the anthropology. It's a matter of that if there are sufficient regulations or basically enforcement of regulations, then researchers would start to follow them. So it's on journals to enforce policies to ensure that all published works have have supplementary information, and no unified policy to ensure that availability and transparency is in place. So definitely the need for unified policy would enable the data availability and data transparency. The third discipline here is political science. And in political science, there is a little emphasis on RDM in the field at all. The replication is a huge problem, despite the DART agreement, which is a joint statement by various well-known political science journals from 2015, directly changes and transparencies that all journals will adhere by 2016, which is 6 years ago. Despite that, definitely 6 years is not a very long period of time in research, but it's long enough to show changes, right? Hopefully, in a matter of the upcoming 10 years, this will exponentially grow, and that's why RDM is picking up right now, and finally, people are getting more and more traction about it. Lack of organization and clarity in data files and codes, in addition to lack of uniformity and standards across journals despite DART. In social work, inconsistency in data collection across multiple branches of social work due to the different level of confidentiality. So inconsistency is definitely one of the most challenging aspects in any automation process. So to automate the process of application, you need some certain aspects to be in place. And to make a standard methodology for something that's changing is very crucial and it's very hard to attain. So with different levels of confidentiality, you need different levels of shareability as well, and you need different levels of reproducibility as well. So for open data movement, for example, the different branches have varying degrees of openness to open data movement due to the sensitivity of some data. The information lost in translation due to different data management of responses on services that contribute to the well-being of individuals, for example. That's another aspect. So the anonymized data from different branches of social work make it tedious or impossible to replicate the data or the research. Finally, for sociology, limited and inconsistent accessibility to research data is one of the huge issues. So having inconsistency is one of the challenges for documentation for sure. Low rates of data availability statements and data citations, lack of regulation on proper methods of data sharing, replication and reuse of data in empirical research rely on data sharing methods, and establishing data policies and providing high-end technologies. Scientific journals can play a significant role in managing and sharing the data. So let's take a moment and think about the challenges here and sum up everything. So lack of awareness is the first thing. So little recognition of the RDM in social sciences is one of the main issues that's happening now in the field. The massive diversity in the nature of data and research across social sciences. So distinct definitions of data, that's a requirement that needs to be in place. Less value assigned to RDM practices. Most qualitative research is specific to time and place. So replication isn't really the right goal here. Then feasibility of data preservation. Some disciplines destroy data after a certain time, as specified by ethics. Anonymization. Many researchers lack the skills or resources to properly anonymize the data. And research data security. Many datasets are vulnerable basically to threats and breaches, and they involve vulnerable populations. The RDM for qualitative and community-based research. Most RDM plans are for quantitative research. Hence, data type matters a lot. Hence, the differences. Qualitative research, no systematic way of decision making or format for data collection, and the community-based research is very specific to the context or community. One final aspect here is the indigenous data sovereignty. So First Nations peoples have historically had complex systems to collect many different types of data. The First Nations principles of ownership, control, access, and position, which is OCAP. First Nations have control over data collection, processes, and own and control how this information can be used. First Nation people understand their own needs the best and can manage access and distribution of indigenous information. Thank you very much. This was talk Spark on RDM, presented to you by Moyo and me, Mohamed. So thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions.
Mohamed, I have a question. If you could talk a little bit about what it is that, as part of our data champions process, we're trying to do to support research data management within the social sciences. So we've talked about the speakers, but maybe talk a little bit about the data management plans and case studies.
Sure. So Spark is trying to offer like more information on the research data management techniques, and basically we are trying to offer the access to case studies on research data management, so that researchers would have the chance to understand what aspects they need to take care of in order to get more of research data management for their specific fields. So we are offering online resources for research data management on our website, and I believe with the upcoming speakers, you would have the chance to highlight more on these case studies and like their applicability in different domains and fields?
Yeah, so specifically, we're focusing the case studies on um, qualitative and mixed methods research, and really trying to think through examples of existing research that we've done within our research team, and going through existing data management plans and really kind of rethinking how we did things, how we could do things better, and then writing those up as case studies to help other researchers reflect on your process and how it applies. And it applies sometimes in slightly tricky ways when you're talking about some of the methods we're looking at: interviewing, focus groups, community engaged research, mixed methods, and surveys. There are some nuances there that we're excited to keep exploring, because we think that there's some room to really expand some of the thinking in that area, and to really acknowledge the great work that has been done by a lot of kind of leading scholars in these individual disciplines who've been kind of moving this forward within their discipline. The conversation is happening in all of the disciplines, but we recognize that we're still at kind of we're still in the early stages of making this standard practice across all of the social sciences.
Yes, definitely. I totally agree with you, Alison. Sorry, there is someone, I think Tina's has her hands on.
Hi, yeah, thank you for a great talk. It's really useful to be hearing about this. I'm just wondering, I do community engaged research, so I'm wondering about data sharing with community organizations who may have their own platforms in place, or like, I'm just wondering if you could recommend any practices or software that would be used, because it might be slightly different than working among researchers, which I think is often just the case. It's more academic researchers working together.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think one of the main challenges is finding the right platform for data sharing. I think I'm not really aware of specific softwares that community organizations can specifically use, as much as because most of the tools that are available are for journal publication, but I'm not sure if these data can be used. The ones that I shared already, for example, the McMaster, like the Dataverse, for example, I think it's not really accessible to communities.
Yeah, that's the problem, right? It's accessible to university, academic institutions, but not community organizations.
Yes.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as, for communities, that part of our job is to not just give them raw data. And so I really like things like Tableau and other kind of dashboard applications for allowing communities to play with the data, but in a way that's a little more user-friendly. I also will do.
Can you put those in the chat, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And then in a lot of our community engaged projects, we will also, like, if clients are providing data, we'll do custom reports for them, and we'll do sort of an infographic for individuals to help them be able to see how they experience things and how that gets translated into the data. So it helps to have a deeper conversation about the different sort of the way that we're interpreting what it is that they're saying and how that aligns with their own experience.
Yeah, I could see that be very useful with many organizations. I'm thinking about Indigenous organizations, though, who do want to have the data, the raw data as well.
Well, and I wonder, Isaac or Danica, if you know this. I know that there are First Nation specific repositories But I don't know the details of what they are or where they are. Isaac or Danica, do you know that? Danica says, McMaster Dataverse is a repository for publishing.
So actually, Danica shared a very important note here that anyone can download these data, but basically they are only publishable or uploadable by institutions. So I think that's one way to access the data, but so I think it's a multifactorial issue because you have data source and you have then the user of the data. So basically, in order to submit your own data, you need something as Alison mentioned, the Tableau, for example. But in order to download data, I think more of the data is publicly accessible, but not necessarily the community basically partners or the community organizations not necessarily able to upload them to these platforms.
So I'm aware that we are out of time. Definitely, if for those of you that are exploring this within your own work or really interested in this, we encourage you to keep the conversation going with us as well as with the RDM team at the library. We're really trying to do our part to figure out what this looks like, but recognize that it really is a community affair, and it's going to take a lot of different thinkers with different perspectives to figure out how exactly this gets translated into different disciplines, and these principles get sort of breathe into the reality of how different disciplines attack their research.
Okay, so I think we have to ask anyone if you have any question, please reach out through email and we can definitely discuss further. But for the talk, I think I will leave it to Lynn to share any information she has.
Yes. Thanks, Mohamed. I did put it in the chat to everyone to thank everyone for coming this morning. We do, excuse me, have a small survey for you to fill out. And if you could take the time to do that, we'd really appreciate it. But thank you all for coming today. And that concludes our talk this morning. Thank you.